Hello, everyone. Welcome back to VRIC Media, your most trusted voice in metals and mining. I'm your host, Darrell Thomas, and today we have the pleasure of interviewing someone who I've been looking forward to having a discussion with, Doomberg. How you doing today?
Darrell, great to see you again, my friend. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Just trying to make sense of the shit show that we've been seeing on the global stage. I was watching an interview with Jeffrey Sachs, and he said President Trump stepped in a pile of shit with this situation. And so I want to unpack this. And I've been getting a lot of propaganda from a lot of different places, a lot of different sources and such. And so I think it's helpful for the audience to understand this. So first I want to start with this conflict with Iran. And I'm curious, in your perspective, did Iran have the capability of creating nuclear weapons? To my understanding, they had enrichment capabilities, but there's a whole process as far as getting to the nuclear weapons side of things. And there's some other influences behind the scenes, and we don't have to get into Zionism or any of the other stuff. I'm just trying not to go down the path of crazy. And so, just curious in your perspective on this conflict.
Yeah, so I think it's important to say a couple of things up front. First of all, we're recording this early on Friday morning.
Yes.
March 6th, and who knows what the headlines will be by the time this publishes. We're recording this about an hour after current President U.S. Trump just posted on social media that the only deal he is willing to accept with Iran is unconditional surrender, with those two words in all caps, which seems an incredibly foolish thing to say. Which leads me to the second thing, which is we all both need to be mindful, I think, that there are U.S. men and women in uniform currently engaged in a war. Whether or not Mike Johnson wishes to use that term, I think any objective observer would say that we're in a war. And during times of war, I think, since we both live in this country, one needs to be careful with what one says during times like this. There's a fine line between pointing out potential flaws in strategy and analyzing what the other side is doing, and then also crossing that line into commentary that would be detrimental to the young men and women who are serving the country overseas. And so I want to say up front that we are mindful of those constraints. We have very strong views as to what's going on and how we got here, but it doesn't mean that now is the time to express them in their entirety. So with those, I think, important disclosures out of the way, history will judge whether or not this war was merited based on fears about Iran getting the bomb. Iran has been alleged to be pursuing the bomb for 50 years. There are arguments to be made pro and con. If you want the pro argument, turn on Fox News. And if you want the con argument, look at the stock market and look at the oil markets today. So we shall see. It is our view this morning that the Trump administration has wildly underestimated the capacity of Iran to execute their part of the struggle. I do sincerely believe that they believed that a decapitation strike would be sufficient. I think it seems as though, again, we're not there. I'm not on the inside. They're sure as heck not asking me for my opinion. It seems as though the wrong lessons from Venezuela were internalized. And here we are. So as we're recording this, in response to Trump's, I think, wildly irresponsible post, Brent is now over 91. Wow. VIX is spiking. And the stock market is crashing. And I think, one of the guys, in times like this, it's important to sort of find signal amongst the noise on social media. And there's a fascinating experiment we've done, which I could talk to you about. But, one of the guys who I recently just met at Tony Greer's conference in Nashville is, Cuppy, Harris Kupperman. And he's been posting, I think, some pretty intelligent analyses. And I could summarize a thread that I saw from him yesterday. I don't know when he posted it. It might have been yesterday. It takes two to taco. And even if Trump wanted an off-ramp right now, Iran would have to be willing to give it to him. And I know this probably sounds bizarre to people who are only getting their news from Fox or CNN or the New York Times, but there's a whole other universe going on out there, and the market is telling us that that things are escalating in a very bad way for U.S. interests rather quickly. I don't know if that's inconsistent with your view, but that's certainly mine and our team's view this Friday morning.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So I'm still kind of developing my view on this. Like, I'm not a geopolitical expert or anything of that nature. I'm just trying to make sense. You know, I was in I think junior high school when 9/11 happened, and then we went through years of war in the Middle East, and it had dramatic impacts on the economy, and many average people, in terms of whether, he had family overseas, or whether, that was how much money was printed, or how much value the dollars lost, whatever the case may be, right? Gold significantly roared higher and such during that. Then we had a burst, when Bush got out of office. And so, it's I think this has drastic impacts. And, there's even numbers of like the U.S. is spending like $1 billion a day in this conflict and such. And so I'm curious in your perspective on the Strait of Hormuz. So this is something that, to my understanding, is very significant. And I've seen, I think, media around Iran sending drone boats towards tankers and such, or attacking tankers that have went through there. And I'm not sure. I've seen some videos where they said like the ships that are going through there have dropped significantly, or ships aren't even going through there at all. So just curious in the impacts from this strait.
Yeah, that strait is closed, period. And it is closed for a variety of reasons, military being just one of them. There's insurance reasons. There's, risk management on the part of the shipping companies, even if they could get insurance. Who wants to put their hardworking employees into the middle of an incredibly hot war? And I tell you, Darrell, I was talking yesterday to the team that this was very reminiscent of how I personally felt in January of 2020, sitting in Home Depot, buying up everything they'd sell me, wondering where the crowd was ahead of the COVID calamity. I can tell you that as somebody who does this for a living, the things I'm hearing from the Trump administration indicate to me that they have no earthly idea what they've uncorked relative to the energy markets. And we're just now beginning to see the consequences of that. So then I spent a lot of time thinking like, okay, what did I get wrong in COVID, And the last time I had this feeling like, am I a contra? Are we near the bottom? There's this tweet this morning, I think this unconditional surrender tweet is so at odds with the reality that I'm seeing that it's actually difficult for me to put words to it. So that strait being closed for any period of time is, as Luke Roman would say, a very short line from here to the end of the Western-based financial system. Okay, last time I had this feeling was the global financial crisis in 08-09, and if I'd just done nothing, the Fed printed and everybody made a lot of money. So under the axiom that the global financial system isn't going to collapse, something has to happen in the next 2 weeks. Okay, I just said it takes two to taco. One of the things that's going to happen in the next 2 weeks is severe food shortages in all of the U.S. Gulf country allies. They don't have a lot of food in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Bahrain. And if that strait is closed, there's going to be a food crisis, a water crisis. If both sides start blowing up each other's desalination facilities, which is on the escalation ladder, something we've written about certainly from the Israeli perspective, for a very long time. So what can give in the next 2 weeks is a fascinating thing. Of course, one of the things that could give is the use of nuclear weapons. And let's both pray to our Lord and Savior that that does not materialize, but it is far closer to reality than I think anybody thought it was a week ago. So, you're catching me on a day where I've kind of would have to confess that I've been shaken a bit by seeing that post by the president. What a incredible thing for a sitting president to say. Really amazing.
Our project is right in the southeastern corner of Wyoming. In the space of 4 years, fully engineered, fully permitted.
The ASIC is what caught my eye, $937 per ounce.
110,000 ounces per annum. First year of production is the most impressive. 132,000 ounces of gold, 24 million pounds of copper. You really want these things front-end loaded like that. US Gold Corp is a near-term, low-cost gold producer in Wyoming. To learn more, go to usgoldcorp.com.
Would you say, just speculating, I imagine Iran has the mentality of we have nothing to lose.
So I've tried to consume a lot of propaganda from both sides, as is our rule. And killing of the Ayatollah is a classic example of the same event being wildly interpreted in different ways. It's celebrated over here. I saw Fox News has their classic deck of cards out with a bunch of red X's through them as though this is some board game. The best analogy I could say is, again, this is going to sound weird to people who only get their news from Western sources. An account that I follow with a Middle Eastern sort of orientation is what has transpired is the equivalent of taking out the Pope at the Vatican during Easter Mass to those who follow the Shia religion. And were that to happen, ask yourself a question. Do you think Catholics would want to cut a deal, or would they be inflamed? Right? And so when I say it takes two to taco, the consequences of what has gone down are just in the very early stages of unfolding. Look, I sincerely hope, first and foremost, that the war ends. I hope that the U.S. achieves its objectives. I hope that as few American soldiers as possible die. I hope the President of the United States has good judgment during these times. One has to hope and trust that he has possession of information that you and I don't have. But as we ended our piece this morning on the European natural gas situation, hope is no strategy, yeah? So we'll see. Trump has a history of saying bombastic things and then reversing himself. So we will see. But it is, again, I to see that 2 minutes before you and I press record is quite a way to start your Friday.
Yeah. What's your view on Israel in this situation? So obviously Israel and Iran have been at odds for a long time, back and forth. I mean, they had a flare-up conflict back in, I think it was last year sometime, and then Trump came in saying, trying to negotiate a deal, and then I believe we dropped the bomb on apparently some of their nuclear facilities or something, but it was buried deep or something, didn't do much damage. I don't know the full story on that, but Israel plays a big part in this, and so I'm kind of curious in your outlook or your perspective there.
Yeah, I've seen, obviously, there's a civil war going on in the conservative side of the ledger on Twitter. I'm sure you've seen this, right? No big secret there. Our view is pretty simple. It's not Israel's fault. It's not a war for Israel. There's one president of the United States. His name is Donald J. Trump. He is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. He is the one responsible for having made this decision. Congress had an opportunity to rein in the executive branch, and they chose not to yesterday, so that responsibility and authority remains with the president. And he alone is accountable for how things go. And there's no country in the world that isn't trying to influence the U.S. president, and it's up to the U.S. president to determine which countries get to influence him and which ones don't. And so if your base case is that this is all Israel's fault, there's the president of the United States, he was elected, he won he won the election fair and square, and the Constitution says this was his decision to make, and he made it. It also means that the consequences of that decision are his too, and his alone. And so, again, circling back to my opening cautionary remarks, I think that's about as much as I want to say on it today with the war going on.
Yeah, for sure. What could be the impacts of, so Iran's launched some attacks. I mean, like you had the UAE, I think their airspace was closed, and they've attacked some of their nearby neighbors, infrastructure, and there's been some headlines about their oil capabilities and such. And so I'm kind of wondering, like, what could transpire out of that, because it's starting to bleed. This conflict is not just Israel, the U.S., and Iran. Now it's like getting others involved.
Yeah, so this is where our efforts to try to find some signal in the noise on social media, I think, have paid off. Iran is executing a completely different strategy than what is being described over here. Their strategy, as declared, is to exhaust the U.S. and Israel's interceptor missile inventory. They claim by firing their old inventory of missiles, and that they're just now getting their good ones out. We'll see if that's propaganda or not. And to fight this war in the Gulf states. They're fighting this war in Bahrain, in Kuwait, in Iraq, in Qatar, in the UAE, and we'll see. So their gambit is that all of these countries that host U.S. bases and that produce the world's energy cannot suffer as much pain as Iran is capable of inflicting. That's the strategy. We shall see if that strategy is effective. But that's what's going on. And so it's going to be a very interesting week in both of those regards. And so we wrote a piece last Sunday called War Dashboard, where we informed our subscribers that the only metric that matters, the only question that matters, is you wake up every day and look and see, is Iran still firing advanced missiles and drones? And if they are, then that's another day in their favor. They're trying to outlast the U.S. They're fighting from their home turf, and the U.S. has an armada there, and their bet is that that armada cannot maintain this posture indefinitely, and they're going to try to win a missile war of attrition. Whether they do or not remains to be seen, but the piece was called War Dashboard, how to follow it, not war prediction. And so that's our view.
Mm-hmm. Is the U.S. munitions low?
I mean, that's our operating mental model. We don't know. Rubio testified as such to the Senate several months ago. Ukraine has been loudly complaining about a lack of air defense missiles. When you say munitions, I'm taught we're focused not on attack missiles, but on defensive ones. Seeing an awful lot of Patriot interceptors going up in the skies in all of these countries. Zelensky was out saying that 800 Patriot missiles have been used in the first week of the war, which is more than Ukraine has fired during the entirety of the special military operation, as Russia calls it, in Ukraine. We'll see. That's our operating theory. That's why our question is Iran still firing advanced missiles and drones? Because if they are, then the U.S. still needs to try to defend against those. I don't think anybody doubts that the Chinese capacity to build missiles is far greater than that of the U.S.
Yeah.
And who are the two happiest people in the world right now? Putin and Xi. Like, every missile fired in the Middle East isn't fired in Ukraine or in defense of Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because I was looking at the economics of it, and I think it was if Iran fires, like you mentioned, like they even fired like some older missiles, and you have these munitions with the interceptors and such, and the economics was I forgot the numbers. Please don't quote me. but it was a significant gap between how much munitions are used to attempt to stop one of these
Sure.
these older missiles. Could you speak to that?
I would say forget about the economics. You can print dollars. You can't print rare earths. Mm-hmm. You can't print missiles. You could print dollars. So if it was just a cost equation, the U.S. would win hands down.
Yeah.
It's not a cost equation. It's a manufacturing equation. It's a supply chain robustness equation. It's all the things we've been writing and warning about, that China had escalation dominance in rare earths and aluminum and manganese and magnesium and nickel and copper, pick your favorite. What's the most interesting thing that hit the wires this week, Darrell? China announcing that it is halting exports of refined products like diesel and gasoline. The world needs Chinese refined products. California needs Chinese refined products. China has a huge crude vulnerability, but it has trapped its neighbors into a refined product vulnerability. The price of jet fuel in Singapore crossed $200 a barrel yesterday. Why? Because China stopped its exports. They're saving everything for the domestic front. They've been buying an extra 1 million barrels of oil a day and sticking it in the ground. The gap between what China can get now and what it needs domestically is a lot smaller than what it would traditionally be doing in an open free market. It would be refining a bunch of diesel, gasoline, and jet fuel and selling it. Now they're just not going to sell it to anybody. They're going to keep it for themselves. So how long can China hold out? A lot longer than the U.S. carrier fleet can stay in the Middle East, is our guess. And that's the big test that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned China, because I was wondering, they've seemed to be very quiet during the initial attack, and then I saw that come out with the halting the exports of refined diesel and such, and then obviously they still have the monopoly on the refined rare earths and such, which is used for military weapons and everything. And so, yeah, so I was reading about Iran has been doing like some deals, I think arms deals or such with Russia. So does Iran have ties with like Russia and China in that way?
Oh, sure. Absolutely they do. Yeah. No, they signed a strategic alliance with Russia, not a defense alliance, but a strategic alliance with Russia. And the Chinese are all up in Iran. And the Chinese have been providing, undoubtedly, advanced satellite targeting information. They're releasing satellite photos of damaged U.S. bases so that the Western media can't deny the impact of what the Iranian counterstrikes has been. That's not being widely reported over here, but it's on the open source. You can find it. And again, the Chinese has spy ships in and around the area. Russia is doing everything. Sergei Lavrov was out yesterday saying Russia will do everything in its power to ensure that Iran does not suffer defeat in this war. That's a pretty unusual thing for a Russian foreign minister to be saying. The U.S. and Europe did everything they could to help Ukraine with munitions and targeting and foodstuffs and so on, and financial support. And why would we think that Russia and China won't do the same for Iran? Of course they will.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that seems very alarming. So what should average folks, investors, and such, I know that you all don't give like investment advice, or you all are not stock investors and such, but what implications, I mean, obviously we see some implications now, but what implications do you think could be coming down the line? I mean, obviously oil, higher.
Well, look, if you have patience, there's not much you can or should do. The long-term real price of all commodities is lower. The higher oil spikes, the harder it will crash. Once this war is over, and it will have to end, as we said in War Dashboard, oil will be cheaper even if nukes are brought out, because last we checked, nuclear war is not bullish for demand. And so this is a crisis, a developing one. I told you, I think, that we sort of are reminiscing to the pre-COVID days. If you did nothing and the Fed opened the printer, you made a ton of money. Nominally, you did even better if you bought gold. We're keeping our gold. We're not really all that exposed to stocks. And again, there's a few forcing functions, lack of food in the Middle East being one of them, potential lack of water being another. And then we'll see. Takes two to tango. If Trump thinks that Iran is anywhere near unconditional surrender, then I guess we're going to have to fight this out for a few more weeks.
Okay. Yeah. And then as far as preparation, I know that that you all do have like some prepping background and such. What should people be thinking about there? I mean, food shortages and...
Yeah, again, preparedness starts at home. So, your pantry is working capital for your factory, which the main product of your factory is the health and well-being of yourself and your family and your friends and your neighbors and your community. If I lived in California, I would not let my gas tank get below 3/4 full. California's a big loser in all of this. And there's not much you can do beyond, stocking up for a week or two or a month. I like to have about 30 days worth of supplies of the various things that are essential to the health and well-being of my family. There's no preparing for a nuclear exchange. I mean, that's kind of, again, Pascal's wager. Why? It's like betting against the existence of God. It just doesn't make any sense. And again, Jim Cramer's many things, but he used to say that you should always buy the nuclear war dip because if you're wrong, who cares, right? So I think, I wouldn't go too overboard, but, little food, little water, little medicine. If you have essential medicines, have an extra month's supply, and you can't really store gasoline for all that long. And the U.S. is going to be fine, by the way. I mean, relative to other countries, the U.S. is now energy efficient. It has a huge amount of fertilizer. Trump will limit exports. I'd be careful. There's a lot of trades going on right now where, a bunch of companies that stand to make a lot of money if they're allowed to export, their stocks are running. Well, don't think for a second that if the U.S. runs low of fertilizer, ammonia, urea, they're just going to stop exports of that. Stop exports of oil, gas, diesel, jet fuel, the same thing China did. That's coming. I just tread carefully. I'm not saying it's going to happen and you have to take an action. I'd say if you were long one of those types of companies, you should have that in the back of your mind as a possible risk. That same risk basically, should be an input into your prepping, which means it's not a risk, it's an advantage. The U.S. is largely self-sufficient. If this war were taking place prior to the shale revolution, we'd be in a whole different ballgame. Trump can keep oil prices down. Thankfully, one of the most talented members of his cabinet happens to be Chris Wright, who's sitting in the chair of the Secretary of Energy. So the U.S. has that. If Trump is seeking advice on what to do, he's got very good counsel in that regard.
Okay, got it. Okay, and any thoughts on the Venezuela situation? I mean, obviously there was talk that we're getting a lot of oil from there, and then also, I mean, I'm hearing a lot about Cuba being the next target for intervention.
But Trump basically said it. I mean, what a time to be alive, Darrell. Yeah, look, Venezuela was small ball compared to this. There's no amount of incremental oil from Venezuela that can replace what is being lost in the, by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. We've not yet seen full-scale attacks on Middle Eastern energy infrastructure by Iran. If we start seeing that, then that is a whole different ballgame. Brings us much closer to nukes, by the way. So there's that escalation left on the ladder, thankfully. Yeah, again, there's just so many moving parts, and by the time we finish recording this, who knows what's happened? It's crazy.
Yeah, and as you used to like to say, energy is life, and so when energy is threatened or whatnot, that could lead to further escalation for sure.
Well, look, if energy is life, the absence of energy is death. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we're modeling is the energy crisis of 21-23 that started in Europe. This one's obviously starting for different reasons. The rich countries were impacted, but they were the ones that set the market clearing price. The poor countries really got crushed. And unfortunately, there's a lot of energy poor countries that won't be able to afford to pay the clearing price so that Germany could keep its lights on. But that's coming too. So you may remember the whole Sri Lanka affair and how that economy collapsed. And there's going to be some out of nowhere economic revolution, political revolution, collapse of economies in the global south that aren't on anybody's board today, but that's coming.
Okay. Okay. And do you think this has profound impacts for the midterm elections?
Oh, yeah. Trump's base is split. And in a 50-50 country, you can't afford to lose hardly any of your base, let alone see it cracked in two. And, I live in flyover country. I can assure you that Trump's decision to go to war in Iran is wildly unpopular with at least a third to a half of his base. And that has to manifest in the midterms, which historically have not treated incumbent presidents all that well to begin with. So depending on how things evolve, sure, things could change. As they stand now, I think the Republicans are facing a wipeout.
Yeah. Dang, that's going to be a whole nother mess we got to talk about at some point. So what are you doing to stay sane during these times and such? You got classic reads and everything.
Yeah, so we pumped out 3 pieces in the last 6 days, so I'm doing that. When I get off with you, I'm going to go check the comments to the one we published this morning. And we also have Classics Read Aloud, which is a nice escape as well. You can find everything that we do over at Doomberg.com, of course.
Yep. All right. Well, you all got the information. Thank you, Doomberg, for coming back on the show. Be sure to hit the subscribe button if you're not subscribed. Love to have your support. And until next time, Doomberg.
Hey, good to see you, brother. Stay safe.
All right, you too.